Okay, so this is Unit 2, Lesson 2. The lesson includes a lot of different topics in it, such as domain, range, end behavior, increasing intervals, decreasing intervals, X-intercepts, and Y-intercepts. This lesson is very important because we're going to use a lot of it throughout the entire year in Algebra 2. Okay. So two definitions to start with. I believe I gave them to you in the first lesson, but this first definition is domain. The domain is a set of values of the independent variable. Typically, it's a set of x values. That's a domain. And the second definition is range. The set of values of the dependent variable. Typically, it's a set of y values. Okay, so range. And so for example 1 and example 2, you're going to have to state the domain and state the range, okay? So example 1a, the domain is the x values in this graph. So you're looking for what x values are covered in this graph. Okay, this is your x-axis, okay? If you notice, this arrow is going to keep going down and to the left forever. Very slowly, but it's going to keep going down and to the left. And it's also going to keep going down and to the right on this side. Very slowly, but it's going to keep going down and to the right. So the domain, the x values, they're going to go on forever to the left and forever to the right. So smaller number first. The domain's going to go from negative infinity to infinity. And you always put parentheses next to negative infinity and infinity. The range is for the y values in this graph. What y values are covered in this graph? Well, it's going to keep going down forever, and it's going to go all the way up to 16 on the y-axis. Okay, we're looking for the y values in this graph. Okay, this is your y-axis. So the graph keeps going down in each direction. So it's going from negative infinity all the way up to 16. So smaller number first. So I'm going to put negative infinity first. I'm going to put the 16 like that. You always put parentheses next to negative infinity and infinity. And since this 16 is a solid circle, I'm going to put this symbol next to 16. Okay, example 1b. Again, domain and range. Domain is for the x values in this graph. What x values are covered in this graph? It's going to keep going to the left, so it's going to cover every x value to the left. And it's going to keep going to the right, so it's going to cover every x value to the right. So again, the domain is from negative infinity to infinity. You always put parentheses next to infinity and negative infinity. The range is for the y values in this graph. What y values are covered in this graph? The y values start at -4, and it's going to keep going up forever in this direction and up forever in this direction. So the range is going to be from -4 all the way up to infinity. Always put a parenthesis next to the infinities, the negative infinities, and a -4, I'm going to put a bracket like that. Okay. The next page talks about what's called end behavior. The end behavior explains what's going on at the ends of the graph. Okay? What is going on at the ends of each graph? So let's look at example 2a. So one end of this graph is over there, the other end is over there. So here's how I'm going to write this. What is happening as x approaches negative infinity? That's what that symbol means. That symbol right there means approaches. Okay. So what is happening as x approaches negative infinity? So as x is getting smaller and smaller, what is happening to the graph? So as x gets smaller and smaller this way, the graph is pointing up. So as x is going to get smaller to the left, the graph is going to keep going up. So here's how I'm going to write that. I'm going to say as x approaches negative infinity, the graph, I'm going to write f of x or y approaches positive infinity. Okay? So as x gets smaller and smaller, as x approaches negative infinity, the graph f of x or y is approaching positive infinity. And what is happening as x approaches positive infinity? So what happens as x gets bigger and bigger this way? Again, the graph is going to be going up. So the graph f of x is going to be approaching positive infinity. Okay, example 1b. End behavior. What is happening as x approaches negative infinity? So what is happening as x gets bigger, as x gets smaller and smaller and approaches negative infinity? The graph is pointing down. So the graph f of x or y is going to be approaching negative infinity. As x gets smaller and smaller, the graph is going to be going down and down. So the graph is going to be approaching negative infinity. Okay. What happens as x approaches positive infinity? What happens as x gets bigger and approaches positive infinity? The graph is going up. Okay, the graph is going to keep going up. So as x gets bigger and bigger, as x approaches infinity, the graph f of x or y is also going to approach infinity. Okay, this next page talks about increasing and decreasing intervals. Okay. So if you look at the graph, it's increasing when the slope is positive. So as you're going uphill, think of it, it's increasing. So in this graph right here, this is where it's increasing, and this is where it's increasing. Where is it decreasing? It's decreasing when it's going downhill or when the slope is negative. Okay. Now, whenever I ask you for increasing and decreasing intervals, there's two key points, okay? Whenever you write increasing or decreasing intervals, you are going to write it using the x values. So we are using x values when we talk about these. And we always write these using parentheses. So we always write increasing and decreasing intervals using x values, and we write them using parentheses. So we have two examples on them. Example 3a, state the increasing and decreasing intervals. So I'm going to do this in blue, okay? Where is it increasing? Let me color in the graph. Where is it increasing? It's increasing right here in blue. That's where the graph is going uphill. That's where the slope is positive, right there in blue. So what x values, because we use the x values, what x values correspond to that? It's -4 to the right. Okay. These are the x values where it's increasing. Okay. So let me write that out. My answer will be increasing. We always use x values, and we always use parentheses. So it's increasing from -4 all the way up to infinity on the x-axis. So that's how I'm going to write my answer. That is where it's increasing. Where is it decreasing? Let me do that in red. That's where it's decreasing on the graph. So what x values correspond to that? Well, -4 to the left. So I'm going to write my answer using parentheses and using the x values. So it's decreasing, smaller number first, from negative infinity on the x-axis all the way up to negative 4 on the x-axis. Let's try another one. Example 3b. Where is the increasing and decreasing intervals? So let's start with increasing. Where is the increasing interval on this graph? Let me color it in blue. That's where it's increasing in blue right there. What are the x values? I don't know if you can see the blue that well, but this is the blue. So what x values go along with that? Right here from 2 to 4. So that's where it's increasing. It's increasing from 2 to 4. Always write these using parentheses, and you always go by the x values. And now let's do the decreasing intervals. So it's decreasing over here in red. See how it's going downhill? The slope is negative. That means it's decreasing over there. And it's also decreasing over here. So it's two intervals where it's decreasing. Let me color in the x-axis to show you in red. So it's decreasing from negative infinity all the way up to 2 on the x-axis. Then you're going to put this symbol for union because it's also decreasing from 4 to infinity on the x-axis. Okay? So those two pages were pretty tricky. The next page is easier because you've seen this before. The next page is on X and Y-intercepts. So an X-intercept is where the graph crosses the X-axis, and a Y-intercept is where a graph crosses the Y-axis. We mentioned this in the first unit. Example 4, state the X and Y-intercepts. So 4a, the X-intercept. We want to make sure we write these the right way now. The X-intercept is right there, and you're going to write that as an ordered pair, so -4 parentheses 0. The Y-intercept is right there. Write that as an ordered pair, 0, 2. Example 4b. There's two X-intercepts now. There's an X-intercept right there, and there's an X-intercept right there. So let's just estimate them. Looks like -4.50 and 0.50. So -4.50. And 0.50. For the Y-intercept, it's right there, so 0, -1. Okay, now the last two pages is just putting all those topics from this lesson together into one. So you have to state everything. You have to state the domain, the range, the end behavior, the increasing intervals, the decreasing intervals, X-intercepts and Y-intercepts. So let's go in order. Let's start with domain. The domain is the x values in the graph. It's going to keep going to the left forever and ever and ever, and it's going to keep going to the right forever and ever and ever. So domain is going to be negative infinity to infinity. The range is the y values in this graph. The y values go from -4 up forever. So -4 to infinity. Parentheses next to infinity and a bracket next to -4 like that. Now let's do the end behavior. So the question is, as x approaches negative infinity, where is the graph approaching? So as x approaches negative infinity, as x gets smaller and smaller this way, the graph is going up and the graph is approaching positive infinity. So f of x is approaching positive infinity. And what happens at the other end of the graph? What happens as x approaches positive infinity? So what happens as x gets bigger and bigger this way? Well, the graph is going up and the graph is also approaching positive infinity. Increasing interval next. It is increasing from here. Let me do it in blue again. This is where it's increasing in blue. That's where the graph is increasing. So let me color in those x values for that. The x values that it's increasing, I colored in from 1 to infinity. Just like that, 1 to infinity. Now let's do the decreasing interval. Look at the graph, it's decreasing right here in red. That's where it's decreasing. Let me color in those corresponding x values that go along with that. So it's decreasing from negative infinity, because it keeps going that way, all the way up to 1 on the x-axis. So decreasing interval, negative infinity up to 1. And last but not least, the X-intercepts and the Y-intercept. This one's going to have 2 X-intercepts. The X-intercepts are where it crosses the x-axis. So -1, 0 and 3, 0. And the Y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis, which is right there, 0, -3. Okay, so we have one more problem like that where we put it all together. This one looks a little different though. Oh boy. Let's start with the domain. Domain is the x values in this graph. The x values, it starts at -5 and it goes to the right forever. So the domain will be -5 to infinity. The range will be the y values in this graph. So the y values, starting looking at the y-axis, at 0 to infinity, because it's going to keep going up very slowly, but it's going to keep going up. So the range will be from 0 to infinity. Next up will be end behavior. End behavior and increasing and decreasing intervals are the hardest. Okay, so if you look, this graph never actually approaches negative infinity. So there's no end behavior for negative infinity. The x stops at -5. So what happens as x approaches -5 for my end behavior? Where does the graph approach? Where does the graph approach as x approaches -5? The graph approaches 0 on the y-axis. So as x approaches -5, the graph f of x approaches 0. That's tricky. And what happens at the other end of the graph? As x approaches infinity, where is the graph approaching? As x approaches infinity, where does f of x approach? As x approaches infinity, the graph is going to keep going up and up and up and up and up and up. So as x approaches infinity, f of x approaches infinity. Next up will be the increasing and decreasing intervals. So increasing interval, and then decreasing interval. The graph is increasing, the graph is going up everywhere. Everywhere it's going up. So when you say increasing intervals, you're using the x values, and it's going from -5 to infinity. That's where it's going up. Always use parentheses for these. And since the graph is increasing everywhere, that means that there are no decreasing intervals, so none. Okay? And that leaves us with the X-intercept still, and then we have the Y-intercept. So the X-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis, or touches it. So -5, 0. That is your X-intercept. And for the Y-intercept, you can just estimate between 1 and 2. Looks a little less than a half, so I'm going to go with 1.4. So I'll say 0, 1.4. That is a tough lesson, but it's a very important lesson in Algebra 2. We are going to review that throughout the year, so it's very important that you understand these topics.